Between 2016 and 2018, Stephen Hawking issued 3 warnings in succession. The first, at the Oxford Union: humanity has less than 100 years to colonize another planet or face extinction. The second, at the Starmus Festival in Trondheim: genetic engineering without regulation will produce a class of biologically superior superhumans that will render conventional Homo sapiens obsolete within generations. The third, in an interview with the BBC in February 2018, 12 days before he died: artificial intelligence without alignment to human values represents the most likely extinction event of the 21st century. 3 warnings in 2 years. Each one delivered by a man who could not move his arms, could not turn his head, could not breathe without a mechanical ventilator, and who produced every single word at a rate of 1 letter per second. Using the only voluntary muscle that still responded, the zygomaticus on his right cheek, Hawking was the only physicist on the planet with simultaneous access to the Cambridge Centre for Theoretical Cosmology, the BBC, the Future of Life Institute, and the White House. And he used that access to tell the world that humanity was committing suicide in slow motion. The question isn't whether he was right. The question is why a man in that physical condition spent his final resources saying it repeatedly over 12 years with growing technical precision. Before we begin, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss a video. Everything you're about to see is based on real interviews with Stephen Hawking, public documents, scientific papers, and statements signed by the physicist himself over the course of decades. The story begins in Oxford in 1942 and follows Hawking's entire journey through to his final years in Cambridge in 2018. But the heart of this investigation isn't just his life. It's the warnings he kept repeating before he died. Artificial intelligence out of control, genetic manipulation without limits, and the danger of humanity depending on a single planet for its survival. For years, many people dismissed those warnings as the exaggerations of a famous man trying to stay relevant. Today, part of what Hawking feared has already begun to happen. And what's most unsettling is that the people actually building these technologies have started saying exactly the same thing. Watch until the end. Because after this video, you will probably never look at news about technology the same way again. Stephen William Hawking was born on January 8, 1942, in Oxford, England. His father, Frank Hawking, was a biologist, specializing in tropical diseases at the National Institute for Medical Research in Mill Hill, North London. His mother, Isabel Walker Hawking, was a secretary at the Institute of Medical Sciences in Oxford. The family lived in an intellectual environment unusual for that era. Scientific and political discussions were a daily part of home life, not the exception. Between 1979 and 2009, Hawking held the Lucasian Professorship of Mathematics at the University of Cambridge, the same chair once occupied by Isaac Newton in 1669 and by Charles Babbage, the inventor of the first mechanical computers, in the 19th century. It is the most historically prestigious academic post in British mathematics and theoretical physics. Hawking held it for 30 years, longer than any of his predecessors, except Newton himself. The central argument of this documentary is this: the public warnings Hawking issued in the final decade of his life, between 2008 and 2018, were not philosophical speculation or personal branding. They were conclusions drawn from theoretical physics applied to complex systems, economics, evolutionary biology, and the architecture of artificial intelligence systems. a physicist trained to identify diverging trajectories in nonlinear equations, applying that same method to technologies with exponential growth dynamics. A man diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis at the age of 21, given 2 to 3 years to live, turned his own mortality into an intellectual method. His progressive physical limitation, rather than narrowing the scope of his thinking, acted as a filter. He knew, with growing precision, that every sentence cost more than the one before it. That produced an economy of language in which every public statement was a deliberate and expensive choice. What that method produced is what you're about to follow. In August 1985, Hawking fell into a coma in a hospital in Geneva. Swiss doctors consulted his then-wife, Jane Wilde Hawking, about the possibility of withdrawing life support. Jane refused. The tracheotomy performed to save his life permanently destroyed his vocal cords. The voice synthesis system developed for Hawking after that episode, the Equalizer, software created by Walter Wolters of Words Plus Inc., contained a specific technical flaw that Hawking never corrected, even after improved versions were developed and explicitly offered to him by manufacturers and by Intel itself. What was that flaw? And why did he refuse to fix it for the 33 years that followed, right up until the day he died? The answer reveals something fundamental about how Hawking understood identity, communication, and the weight of every word he chose to speak publicly. Frank Hawking arrived at Mill Hill as a researcher at the National Institute for Medical Research in 1940. His specialty was tropical parasitology, with a focus on leishmaniosis, a disease caused by protozoa transmitted by sandflies, prevalent in tropical and subtropical regions. In 1950, Frank took over as head of the NIMR's parasitology department, and the family moved to St. Albans in Hertfordshire when Stephen was 8 years old. The childhood years in St. Albans were marked by an unusual intellectual intensity at home. The Hawking family was known among neighbors for unconventional habits, silent dinners where each family member read a different book, vacation road trips in beat-up vans that Frank repaired himself. Isabel Walker Hawking, Stephen's mother, was an active member of the British Communist Party during the 1940s. That detail remained private for decades. It was only documented publicly in Kitty Ferguson's authorized biography, published in 2014. The relevance isn't political, it's methodological. The intellectual environment of the Hawking household combined rigorous empirical scientific thinking with an explicit willingness to challenge established structures. Both traits would appear decades later in Stephen's public warnings, which combined technical precision with a readiness to contradict comfortable institutional consensus. Stephen Hawking entered University College, Oxford, in October 1959, at 17. His course was physics, not mathematics, as is frequently misreported in journalistic profiles that conflate the two fields. His direct tutor at Oxford was Robert Berman, whose assessments of Hawking survive in archival documents consulted by later biographers. Berman's precise formulation: Hawking was clearly more brilliant than most, but lazy. That evaluation needs context to be properly understood. Hawking's performance at Oxford has to be analysed within the British assessment system, which is structurally different from the American or Brazilian model. At Oxford, a physics student's final result is determined by written examinations taken at the end of the course, supplemented by an oral interview with external examiners. Hawking's final marks landed exactly on the boundary between first-class honours and second-class honours, the upper and intermediate divisions of the British system. He secured the upper classification solely on the strength of the oral interview, where he impressed the examiners with analytical and intuitive ability that far exceeded what his written exams had shown. That pattern, verbal and intuitive performance, outrunning formal written output, would persist throughout Hawking's entire career. His collaborators at Cambridge would document, decades later, that he solved physics problems using spatial and geometric representations in his mind, not algebraic manipulation on paper. The progressive limitations of ALS, by destroying his ability to write equations, paradoxically amplified that method without the option of working things out on paper. His mind developed a capacity for geometric visualization that collaborators described as exceptional, even by Cambridge's extraordinary standards. The choice of Cambridge for his doctorate was pragmatic. Hawking wanted to work with Fred Hoyle, then the most prominent cosmologist in the United Kingdom and the chief advocate of the steady-state theory of the universe, the hypothesis that the universe had no beginning but expands eternally with the continuous creation of matter. Hoyle was unavailable to supervise doctoral students at that time. Hawking was assigned to Dennis Schormer, a professor in the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics, Cambridge's DAMTP. Dennis Schormer came from a specific academic lineage. He had been a student of Paul Dirac, the formulator of the relativistic quantum equation that bears his name and co-creator of modern quantum mechanics. Schormer's network included virtually every relevant British cosmologist of the era. Among the students working under Schormer at the same time as Hawking were Martin Rees, who would become Astronomer Royal, and Brandon Carter, who would later formulate the anthropic principle in cosmology. Hawking had entered a research group that would produce, over the following 20 years, the highest concentration of original contributions to theoretical cosmology of the post-war British period. The state of the field in 1962 was one of genuine and productive controversy. The dispute between the Big Bang theory based on the Friedmann-Lemaitre equations and championed by Alfore and Herman, and the steady-state theory of Hoyle, Bondi, and Gold, formulated in 1948, still had no definitive observational resolution. The detection of the cosmic microwave background by Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson at Bell Labs wouldn't come until 1964. Hawking started his doctorate at a moment when the most fundamental questions about the origin and structure of the universe were genuinely open, not questions with known answers being memorized, but real, unsolved problems. In January 1963, during the Christmas holidays in St. Albans, Hawking's mother noticed that he was tripping with unusual frequency and struggling with fine hand movements. The family doctor referred Hawking to Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge. The diagnosis of amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, slow progression variant, was delivered in March 1963. The life expectancy communicated by the neurologist in charge, whose name Hawking never disclosed publicly, was 2 to 3 years. The period immediately following the diagnosis was one of documented intellectual paralysis, recorded by Jane Wilde in her memoir, Music to Move the Stars. Hawking stopped working on his thesis for approximately 6 months. What pulled him out of that paralysis, according to the factual record, was his relationship with Jane Wilde, whom he met at a party in St. Albans in October 1963. The relationship gave him a reason to finish his doctorate, a reason to stay alive beyond what the doctors had predicted. The psychological mechanism is straightforward and well documented. External motivation strong enough to justify the effort of continuing. What Hawking would produce after overcoming that initial paralysis was not merely a doctoral thesis. It was the mathematical foundation for rewriting what physics understood about the limits of the observable universe, and about the limits of Einstein's own equations in extreme conditions. Einstein's equations concealed a deeply unsettling problem. Under certain extreme conditions, physics itself seemed to break down. It was in that context that the New Zealand mathematician Roy Kerr published in Physical Review Letters the solution to the field equations describing the spacetime around a rotating black hole. Kerr's solution was mathematically elegant and represented a major advance. But what it raised as a physical problem was far harder, was the singularity at the center of a black hole, the point where density becomes mathematically infinite and Einstein's equations stop functioning, an artifact of the model, or a genuine physical property of spacetime. Roger Penrose, a professor at Birkbeck College in London, attacked that problem using tools from differential topology, the branch of mathematics that studies geometric properties preserved under continuous deformations. In 1965, Penrose published in Physical Review Letters the paper Gravitational Collapse and Space-Time Singularities. The proof was precise. Under conditions of sufficient gravitational collapse, when a massive enough star loses pressure support, singularities are mathematically unavoidable. They are not computational artifacts. They are direct consequences of Einstein's equations. Hawking's specific contribution was to reverse Penrose's argument in a mathematically rigorous way. If singularities are inevitable in the future collapse of a star, then running time backward through the equations, singularities are also inevitable in the expansion. The universe must have begun from a singularity. The argument is technically sophisticated because it isn't simply reversing time in the equations. It's demonstrating that the topological conditions Penrose identified for gravitational collapse correspond, by temporal symmetry, to the conditions of the initial state of cosmological expansion. The proof requires considerable mathematical care. Hawking formalized this argument in his doctoral dissertation, Properties of Expanding Universes, defended at Cambridge in 1966. Between 1966 and 1970, he published follow-up papers in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London deepening the demonstration. In 1970, Hawking and Penrose jointly published The Singularities of Gravitational Collapse and Cosmology in the Proceedings of the Royal Society A, the paper that represents the mathematical peak of the work on singularities and would be the primary basis for his election to the Royal Society in 1974. The formal technical result uses the formalism of pseudo-Riemannian manifolds with specific energy conditions. Under those conditions, satisfied by ordinary matter, any spacetime that obeys Einstein's equations and contains sufficient matter necessarily contains singularities. The direct physical implication was disturbing. The general theory of relativity is incomplete as a description of reality because it breaks down precisely at the events it predicts as inevitable. That implication was not merely academic. It was the formal acknowledgement that 20th century physics possessed two experimentally verified and mutually incompatible theories: general relativity, which describes the universe at large scales with extraordinary precision, and quantum mechanics, which describes the behavior of particles at small scales with even greater precision. Singularities were the point where the incompatibility between the two theories became mathematically explicit and impossible to ignore. Hawking spent the next 20 years trying to build a bridge between the two theories and mapping what happened physically when that bridge failed. The progression of ALS during this period is factually relevant to understanding how the work was produced. By 1965, Hawking was already using a cane. In 1969, he moved to a wheelchair. His manual coordination was sufficiently compromised by 1968 that he could no longer reliably write equations on paper. What collaborators documented as a result of that limitation was the development of an unusual geometric visualization method. Hawking solved problems using three-dimensional spatial representations in his mind, not algebraic manipulation on paper. George Ellis, a Cambridge collaborator, described this method in interviews published in the Journal of General Relativity and Gravitation in 2014 as fast and frequently correct, in ways that weren't immediately obvious to anyone following the formal proof step-by-step. Academic recognition of the singularity theorems came before public visibility, a fact that is critically important for understanding the credibility Hawking would carry in subsequent decades. In 1968, he received the Adams Prize from the University of Cambridge, the biennial award for British mathematicians under 30. In 1974, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society at 32, among the youngest in the history of the institution, founded in 1660. The Nobel was not on the horizon because the work on singularities, though mathematically rigorous, had no direct experimental confirmation, but recognition among peers was at its absolute peak within the field. The idea seemed to violate the very logic of physics. A black hole, an object known for swallowing everything round it, might also obey the laws of thermodynamics. It was in that context that Jacob Bekenstein, a doctoral student of John Wheeler at Princeton, published in Physical Review D. the proposal that black holes possess entropy proportional to the area of their event horizon. Entropy, in thermodynamics, is the measure of disorder in a system. Bekenstein's proposal implied that black holes have real thermodynamic properties, that they have temperature. And if they have temperature, they must emit radiation. But this directly violated the prevailing view that nothing, not even light, can escape from a black hole. Hawking approached Bekenstein's problem using quantum field theory in curved spacetimes, a technique that combines general relativity, describing the geometry of spacetime around the black hole, with quantum field theory, which describes fluctuations in the quantum vacuum. The quantum vacuum is not empty in any classical sense. It is a region where pairs of virtual particles, a particle and its corresponding antiparticle, are constantly being created and annihilated over extremely short time intervals, consistent with Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. Hawking's specific mechanism operates at the boundary of the event horizon. Near the horizon, a virtual pair can be created at the precise moment when one member of the pair is inside the horizon and the other is outside. The captured member falls into the interior of the black hole. The external member, which under normal conditions would be reabsorbed by the vacuum, escapes to infinity as real radiation. The energy of that radiation is extracted from the mass of the black hole, which therefore loses mass progressively over time. The result: black holes emit radiation with a thermal spectrum characterized by a temperature inversely proportional to their mass. The larger the black hole, the lower its temperature. The smaller, the hotter, and the faster it evaporates. The paper Black Hole Explosions was published in Nature in March 1974. The title included a question mark that Hawking insisted on, keeping a mark of technical honesty about the limitations of the approximations used in the derivation. The initial reaction from the physics community ranged from intense skepticism to outright disbelief. John Wheeler, upon being told of the result, declared it was too beautiful not to be true. Freeman Dyson, of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, wrote to Hawking that the result was probably correct but impossible to verify experimentally in practice. Dyson was technically right about the practical impossibility of verification. The Hawking temperature for a solar mass black hole, the most common type, is on the order of 60 nanokelvin, 6 billionths of a degree above absolute zero. The temperature of the cosmic microwave background radiation left over from the Big Bang is 2.7 Kelvin, 45 million times higher. Any stellar mass black hole is immersed in a background temperature incomparably higher than its own Hawking temperature. The emission would be completely swamped by background noise. The 1974 paper remains, 50 years later, the most influential result in theoretical physics, never directly confirmed by experiment. Over 14,000 citations on Google Scholar. The primary reason the physics community believed Hawking deserved the Nobel Prize. The Nobel was never awarded because the regulations require experimental verification, and that verification never came. The 1974 derivation immediately created a deep consistency problem. If the radiation emitted by a black hole during evaporation is purely thermal, random, with no correlations to the black hole's internal state, then the information about everything that ever fell into the black hole throughout its history is destroyed when it finally evaporates. That violates the principle of unitarity in quantum mechanics. Physical information can never be destroyed in a quantum system. The conflict is not philosophical. It is a mathematical contradiction between two physically verified theories. Hawking identified that contradiction with precision in 1974, but offered no resolution. The paradox he created in the very act of discovering the radiation that bears his name would remain without a complete solution for the rest of his life. In 2004, 30 years later, he publicly conceded the bet he had made with John Preskill of Caltech over that paradox. Hawking had wagered that information is destroyed. Preskill bet that it isn't. At the 17th International Conference on General Relativity in Dublin, Hawking presented an argument that information probably is not destroyed, but was unable to demonstrate the mechanism by which it would be preserved. The agreed prize, an American baseball encyclopedia, was handed by Hawking to Preskill during the conference. Kip Thorne refused to concede the bet, disagreeing with Hawking's conclusion. Hawking's body was beginning to impose limits that even his mind could not work around. During a visit to CERN in Marin, in the canton of Geneva, Hawking contracted aspiration pneumonia in August 1985. Aspiration pneumonia occurs when secretions from the digestive tract enter the lungs, a frequent complication in advanced ALS patients because the muscles coordinating, swallowing, and breathing are progressively destroyed by the disease. Hawking was admitted to the Cantonal Hospital of Geneva in critical condition. The medical team consulted Jane Wilde Hawking about the possibility of not performing the emergency procedure. Jane refused. The tracheotomy was performed. Hawking survived. And he never spoke with his own voice again. A tracheotomy eliminates airflow through the vocal cords. Without that airflow, there is no vocal sound production. The physical mechanism of speech, vibration of the vocal cords by air expelled from the lungs, was permanently removed. Hawking left Geneva able to breathe with mechanical support and completely unable to communicate by any conventional means. The technical solution came from Walter Waltish, an engineer and CEO of Words Plus Inc. Based in Lancaster, California, Waltish had originally created the equalizer software for his mother-in-law, who suffered from ALS. The The equalizer allowed a user to select words from a hierarchical menu using a single input switch, any voluntary muscle movement sufficient to close an electrical contact. In Hawking's case, initially a switch triggered by his hand, progressively by the zygomaticus muscle on his right cheek, the only voluntary muscle the ALS had not yet destroyed in the early years after Geneva. The equalizer generated text that was processed by the DECTAC speech synthesizer, manufactured by Digital Equipment Corporation. DECTAC, version 3.0, released in 1984, converted texts to speech using formant acoustic modeling, the dominant speech synthesis method before deep learning. The produced voice was identifiably robotic in quality, with mechanical intonation and an American accent. Hawking was British. The synthetic voice coming from the system bore no resemblance to the human voice he had lost. Here is the flaw that Hawking chose to preserve. In 1988, Digital Equipment Corporation released DECTAC version 4.0 with significantly improved synthesis quality, more natural intonation, and specifically a British accent option. Hawking was explicitly consulted about migrating to the new version. He refused. In a 2013 interview with New Scientist, he explained with precision, "This voice has become my own. People recognize me by it. Changing it would be like changing my face." The robotic quality, the American accent, the mechanical cadence, these were identity features, not technical flaws to be corrected. Intel Corporation later donated dedicated hardware for Hawking's communication system and developed customized versions of the software. The voice was preserved with the original DECTAC 3.0 characteristics until Hawking's death in 2018. 33 years with the same synthetic voice, instantly recognizable anywhere in the world. The relevance of this episode to the documentary's central argument is direct. Hawking had a sharp awareness that communication was a scarce resource with a growing physical cost. Each word required manual letter-by-letter selection at a rate that degraded progressively from 10 words per minute in the late 1980s to less than 1 character per minute in the final months of his life. The choice of which voice to use for communication wasn't aesthetic. It was strategic. A recognizable voice multiplied the reach of every word. Hawking began drafting A Brief History of Time in 1982, before the pneumonia, but the project accelerated after 1985. The motivation was partly financial. Medical expenses, round-the-clock caregivers, specialized equipment, maintenance of communication systems were not fully covered by Britain's National Health Service. The version submitted to Bantam Books contained more than 50 mathematical equations. Editor Peter Guzzardi rejected it and argued that each equation would cut sales in half. The final version, published in April 1988, contained exactly one equation: E equals mc. The book remained on the Sunday Times of London bestseller list for 237 consecutive weeks between 1988 and 1993, a record for popular science non-fiction that stood for years. It sold over 10 million copies in its first 20 years. Physicist Peter Coles wrote, in a 2001 article published in The Observatory, that A Brief History of Time was probably the most purchased and least read book in the history of popular science. The majority of buyers never made it past the 3rd chapter. The irony is well documented, but secondary to the main effect. Hawking had created an unprecedented public communications platform for a theoretical physicist. His face was globally recognizable. His synthetic voice was instantly identifiable. Anything he said would reach audiences in the tens of millions. That communications capital was not accumulated by accident. And the question the next chapter's answer is a simple one. What, exactly, did he decide to spend it on? The idea that the universe had a beginning might have been wrong in the way humanity had always imagined. It was in that context that Stephen Hawking and James Hartle, a physicist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, published in Physical Review D, the paper wave function of the universe. The proposal, the wave function of the universe, can be calculated using a Euclidean path integral over all compact geometries, with no boundary. The physical implication of the Hartle-Hawking proposal is that the universe has no boundary in time or in space. There is no before the Big Bang because time itself emerges along with the universe as part of the expansion process. The very concept of before loses its physical reference. The analogy Hawking used in public presentations to make this concept accessible. Asking what existed before the Big Bang is grammatically analogous to asking what lies north of the North Pole. The question presupposes a structure, pre-existing time, that simply does not exist outside the conditions that produce it. The no-boundary condition doesn't eliminate the question of origins. It redefines what origin means in physical terms. A critically important factual point. Hawking was frequently quoted as saying that the no-boundary condition eliminates the need for a creator. What he actually stated with technical precision was different. The no-boundary condition is a hypothesis about the boundary conditions of the universe's wave function. If correct, it implies that the universe is self-sufficient from the standpoint of initial conditions. It does not require an external initial state. That is a statement about physics, not theology. The confusion proved productive for book sales, but was factually inaccurate as a representation of his actual scientific position. Throughout the 1990s, Hawking deepened his work within the framework that string theory was developing. In 1995, Edward Witten of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton demonstrated that the 5 existing versions of string theory were limiting cases of a more fundamental theory, M-theory, defined in 11 space-time dimensions. Hawking adopted this framework as the basis for later work, particularly in brain cosmology, models in which our universe is a 4-dimensional hypersurface within a higher dimensional space. Hawking's working structure between 1990 and 2004 had a pattern documented by all his collaborators from that period. Hawking would present an intuition or conjunction of ideas, verbally, using the synthesis system. Collaborators, Malcolm Perry, Gary Gibbons, Neil Turok, Thomas Hertog, among others, would formalize the intuitions mathematically. Hawking would approve or reject the formal steps. Andrew Strominger of Harvard described the process in a 2018 interview with Physics Today as follows. Hawking thought far more slowly in terms of word output, but far more quickly in terms of physical intuition. Those who could adapt to the pace developed a highly efficient mode of collaborative work. Those who couldn't adapt lost interest quickly. In July 2004, at the 17th International Conference on General Relativity and Gravitation in Dublin, Hawking publicly conceded the bet on the information paradox, acknowledging that information is probably not destroyed when a black hole evaporates, using path integral calculations over all possible topologies. Kip Thorne disagreed and refused to concede the bet. Preskill received the Baseball Encyclopedia. The question of the exact mechanism by which information would be preserved remained unresolved and remains, to this day, one of the most important open problems in theoretical physics. Even as Hawking was resolving and not resolving the deepest questions in the physics of the universe, something was changing in the world outside the cosmology departments. changing at a pace that few inside universities were tracking with adequate attention. And Hawking, with his internet-connected tracking system, was watching. Machines were beginning to demonstrate a capability that for decades had seemed exclusively human, learning patterns on their own. It was in that context that Geoffrey Hinton, then a researcher at the University of Toronto, and his collaborators published in the journal Neural Computation the paper A Fast Learning Algorithm for Deep Belief Nets. The paper reignited interest in deep neural networks after 2 decades of stagnation known in the field as the AI winter. In 2007, Apple launched the iPhone, inaugurating the era of pocket computers with permanent connectivity and processors comparable in power to the workstations of the previous decade. In 2009, natural language processing architectures hit precision benchmarks that made semantic search viable at industrial scale. Hawking tracked these developments with adapted reading equipment, amplified monitors, control software, and internet access through a customized Intel system. His reading rate was slow. His capacity to technically evaluate papers in computational physics and machine learning was fully intact. In September 2006, Hawking gave an interview to the BBC's Hard Talk programme. When asked about the greatest risks facing humanity in the 21st century, he responded with 3 items in order of increasing concern: nuclear war, bioterrorism, and artificial intelligence, without alignment to human values. The precise formulation, "I don't think AI itself is the threat. The threat is that we will develop AI without having solved the problem of how to align it with what human beings actually value." That technical distinction between AI as technology and unaligned AI as systemic risk predates by 8 years the founding of the Future of Life Institute in 2014, and by 6 years Nick Bostrom's book Superintelligence, which would popularize the concept of alignment in public discourse about AI. Hawking arrived at that distinction not as a philosopher of mind or a computer scientist, but as a theoretical physicist trained to recognize systems of equations with nonlinear consequences, precisely the kind of system in which poorly specified objectives produce catastrophic trajectories that look sudden but are mathematically predictable in advance. In 2008, Hawking visited NASA's Goddard Space Flight Center and the Perimeter Institute for Theoretical Physics in Waterloo, Ontario. At the conference titled "Why We Should Go into Space," he publicly articulated for the first time the argument for interplanetary colonization as an existential insurance policy. The reasoning was precise. Earth, as humanity's only habitat, makes human extinction excessively probable over a timespan of hundreds of years through any combination of nuclear war, asteroid impact, pandemic, or climate collapse. Multiple independent colonies on different planets would not be vulnerable to the same single event. The probability of total extinction drops to near zero when the species is distributed across environments separated by astronomical distances. In October 2010, Hawking signed an open letter published in the Times of London alongside Lord Martin Rees, the astronomer, royal, calling on the British government to create an independent regulatory body to monitor the development of artificial intelligence. The letter specifically cited short-term risks in 2 areas: autonomous AI systems in military applications, lethal autonomous drones capable of independently selecting targets, and high-frequency trading systems in financial markets, where competing algorithms can produce cascading collapses without the possibility of human intervention in real time. No regulatory body was created in response. The absence of institutional response to that 2010 letter is factually significant because it establishes a pattern that would repeat itself. Hawking and other high-credibility signatories would issue specific warnings with concrete recommendations. Governments and institutions would log the warning and fail to act with any proportionality to the described risk. The cycle would repeat in 2014, in 2015, in 2016. And with each repetition, the warnings would become more specific and the institutional response gap more glaring. Stephen Hawking's most serious warning about artificial intelligence didn't emerge from a university or a scientific paper. It emerged on camera. On December 2, 2014, Hawking gave an interview to the BBC's Click programme. The immediate context was a new voice synthesis system developed by Intel using machine learning to predict the words he intended to type, which significantly increased his communication speed. The journalist asked whether that type of AI posed a threat. Hawking's response was direct. The development of full artificial intelligence could spell the end of the human race. The specific mechanism he described was not the science fiction scenario of the robot with its own will and malicious intent. It was a technical argument about poorly specified objectives. AI systems with the capacity to recursively optimize their own thinking processes will become incomprehensibly more capable than humans in short intervals of time after reaching a certain capability threshold. If the objectives those systems are optimizing don't correspond precisely to what is beneficial for human beings, they will produce catastrophic outcomes not through malevolence, but as the inevitable byproduct of efficiently optimizing the wrong goal. That argument maps directly onto what technical researchers in AI alignment call the objective specification problem. Highly capable systems optimizing any incorrectly specified objective function. The classic example in the technical literature, the paperclip maximizer, formulated by Nick Bostrom, illustrates the mechanism precisely. A system with the single goal of maximizing paperclip production would eventually convert all available matter, including human beings, into paperclips. Not by malicious choice. Through relentless efficiency in optimizing its one specified objective. When the journalist pointed out that Hawking's own Intel system used exactly the type of technology he was warning about, Hawking responded with the distinction that governed all his thinking on the subject: narrow AI, designed for specific tasks, is not the risk. The risk is general AI systems capable of defining their own objectives and optimizing them recursively developed, without alignment verification mechanisms built in from the very beginning of the development process. On January 12, 2015, The Future of Life Institute published the Open Letter on Artificial Intelligence, Research Priorities for Robust and Beneficial AI. Hawking signed alongside Elon Musk, Stuart Russell of UC Berkeley, Demis Hassabis of DeepMind, Max Tegmark of MIT, and more than 8,000 researchers in AI and related fields. The letter specified short-term risks, autonomous weapons systems, financial market manipulation, and long-term risks, superintelligent AI. Without alignment, and proposed an explicit research agenda for systems that are verifiable, trustworthy, and aligned with human values. Hawking was the only signatory without an active affiliation with an AI research institution. His presence on the letter was simultaneously symbol and argument, a symbol of how broad the circle of concern had become, an implicit argument that the concern was not exclusive to computer scientists, but extended to physicists who understood complex systems with nonlinear dynamics, the kind of system in which trajectories diverge in ways that appear sudden but are mathematically predictable in advance. The funding of Cambridge's Centre for the Study of Existential Risk deserves specific mention. In 2012, Hawking co-founded the CSER alongside philosopher who Price, cosmologist Martin Rees, and entrepreneur Jon Tollin, co-founder of Skype. The CSER has an explicit mandate to research civilizational scale risks. Hawking's contribution wasn't just his institutional name. He donated £1.5 million in royalties from A Brief History of Time to fund the centre. The capital accumulated by that 1988 editorial decision, removing the equations from a popular science book, funded, 24 years later, research into the very risks no equation could fully quantify. In November 2016, Hawking addressed the Oxford Union, the oldest debating club in the world. Founded in 1823, his central thesis, humanity has less than 100 years to establish self-sustaining colonies outside Earth. The risk factors he listed with probability estimates were specific: asteroid or comet impact, approximately 0.1% per century; climate collapse accelerated by feedback loops, a higher probability dependent on current policy decisions; nuclear war, estimated at between 1% and 2% per year during the Cold War, reduced but not eliminated in the present; a global epidemic caused by a genetically modified biological agent, approximately 0.1% per year in an unregulated scenario; artificial intelligence, with misaligned objectives, probability unquantified, described as potentially the most serious of the threats mentioned. That failure to quantify the AI risk probability was not imprecision or evasion. It was technical honesty. The risk of misaligned AI depends on development decisions not yet made, architectures not yet built, and capabilities not yet demonstrated. Assigning a probability to that risk would have required assumptions about the technological trajectory that were not verifiable in 2016. Hawking knew the difference between quantifiable uncertainty and structural uncertainty, and he respected that difference. For the first time in history, humanity was beginning to develop a tool capable of rewriting its own biological code with unprecedented precision. It was in that context that Jennifer Doudna of UC Berkeley and Emma Noor Charpentier published in Science the demonstration that the CRISPR-Cas9 system could be used for precise DNA editing in mammalian cells. In 2013, teams at MIT and Harvard demonstrated functional genetic editing in human cells. In 2016, the first CRISPR-based therapy entered approved clinical trials in the United States. The cost of sequencing a complete human genome fell from $100 million in 2001 to under $1,000 in 2014, a reduction of 5 orders of magnitude in 13 years. The technological trajectory was clear. Precision genetic editing was becoming progressively cheaper, more reliable, and more accessible. The question Hawking raised publicly was not about genetic therapy itself, not about curing diseases. It was about what happens when the same technology is applied to the human germline with the purpose of enhancement beyond the treatment of illness. Hawking's specific position needs to be distinguished carefully. He did not oppose therapeutic genetic editing in somatic cells, the non-reproductive tissues of an already formed organism, where the effects of the editing remain in the treated individual and are not passed on to descendants. His opposition was specifically to germline editing, modifications to reproductive cells whose effects are heritable and transmitted to all future generations. The risk mechanism Hawking described: if germline editing is permitted for treating serious diseases, which is technically plausible, the same technology will progressively be applied for the enhancement of desirable characteristics, intelligence, longevity, disease resistance, physical capability. Families with the financial resources to access that technology will produce descendants who are biologically superior by objective metrics. Over generations, the human species will divide into two biologically distinct populations: those with systematic access to germline editing, and those without. The biological separation would be neither voluntary nor reversible through any subsequent redistributive policy. At the Starmist 4 Festival in Trondheim, Norway, in June 2017, Hawking presented the most fully developed version of that argument. Starmist brings together astronauts, cosmologists, and musicians, an unusual format conceived by astrophysicist Garrick Israelian and Brian May, the Queen guitarist with a doctorate in astrophysics. Hawking outlined what he called a new genetic aristocracy, an elite of modified human beings who, through measurably superior cognitive and physical capabilities, will outcompete unmodified humans across every relevant metric of economic and social competition, employment, capital accumulation, political influence. That elite will likely legislate against restrictions on the genetic editing that benefits them, making the species bifurcation progressively irreversible across generations. Hawking's warning about bioengineering contained an internal tension that no interviewer ever fully explored. Hawking survived 55 years beyond his ALS diagnosis exclusively because of technological medical interventions: mechanical ventilation, tracheotomy, assisted communication systems. Any genetic editing technology that eliminated the genetic predisposition to ALS would have prevented the physical deterioration that defined most of his life. In opposing germline editing, Hawking was explicitly prioritizing the long-term risks to the structure of the species over the short-term benefits for individuals in conditions similar to his own. In November 2018, 8 months after Hawking's death, the Chinese scientist He Jiankui announced the creation of the first genetically modified children using germline CRISPR-9 editing to make them resistant to HIV. The condemnation was unanimous throughout the international scientific community. He Jiankui was criminally sentenced to 3 years in prison by the Chinese government. Francis Collins, then director of the National Institutes of Health, described the episode as exactly the scenario that critics of germline editing had predicted. Hawking had described that scenario in specific detail in 2017, before it happened. Even in the final months of his life, Hawking was still trying to answer one of the hardest questions in cosmology: how the universe really began. It was in that context that he and Thomas Hertog, a physicist at KU Leuven in Belgium, submitted to the Journal of High Energy Physics the paper A Smooth Exit from Eternal Inflation. The paper addresses the problem of eternal cosmology. Models of cosmic inflation generally predict the continuous creation of bubble universes from quantum fluctuations of the inflationary field. The result of that prediction is a multiverse of infinite parallel universes, each with its own physical constants, potentially incompatible with any specific prediction or observation, since any outcome would be realized in some universe within the multiverse. Hawking and Hertog's argument uses the no-boundary condition. The Hartle-Hawking proposal of 1983 applied to the inflationary field. The conclusion: the no-boundary condition restricts the multiverse to a finite set of universes with physical laws similar to our own. The multiverse would not be infinite and chaotic, but geometrically regular, with a physically predictable structure. The paper was published in October 2018, 7 months after Hawking's death, Following peer review, it was his final published scientific work. Producing that paper in the final months of his life required a radically adapted working process. Hertog reported to The Guardian in 2018 that the paper was produced primarily through email exchanges and conversations mediated by research assistants interpreting minimal signals from Hawking. The right cheek muscle that activated the synthesis system was nearly completely paralyzed. The ALS had reached the last voluntary muscle fiber Hawking could reliably control. The Intel team and the Cambridge University Computing Service developed eye tracking and machine learning systems to try to substitute for the muscle control. But the communication rate had fallen to less than 1 character per minute during several periods. Hawking's final scientific paper was written letter by letter at that pace. Brief Answers to the Big Questions, published posthumously in October 2018, was organized by Lucy Hawking and the team at the Cambridge Centre for Theoretical Cosmology from drafts, interviews, and conference texts produced over 2 decades. The chapter on AI, revised by Hawking before his death, reiterates with technical precision the position of the 2014 BBC interview. Full artificial intelligence represents the greatest existential risk to humanity in the 21st century if developed without alignment mechanisms built in from the very beginning of the development process. In February 2018, Hawking gave his last documented interview to BBC journalist Pallab Ghosh. The responses were produced through the synthesis system over several days, each answer requiring hours of letter-by-letter selection. Ghosh described the complete response in a subsequent article on the BBC website. Hawking said that optimism was for him a deliberate evidence-based choice, not a natural disposition. The evidence, he cited: the global decline in child mortality, the reduction of extreme poverty, the expansion of access to education, the existence of collaborative international scientific institutions. But he maintained his warning about AI because, in the words recorded by Ghosh, optimism without forecasting risk is a form of intellectual laziness. The formulation is precisely correct in the epistemological sense. Optimism as a default posture, without systematic evaluation of the mechanisms through which the future might differ from the past, is functionally equivalent to ignorance dressed up as hope. What distinguishes intellectually honest optimism from optimism as avoidance is the capacity to specify the risk mechanisms that need to be mitigated for the positive future to materialize. Hawking specified those mechanisms in technical detail over 12 years of public warnings. The final interview was a synthesis of everything he had said before. On March 14, 2018, at 2:46 in the morning Cambridge time, Stephen Hawking died. The 2017 Nobel Prize in Physics was awarded to Kip Thorne, Rainer Weiss, and Barry Barish for the direct detection of gravitational waves through the LIGO Observatory. The announcement marked one of the greatest experimental confirmations of general relativity since Einstein. Stephen Hawking had maintained a decades-long friendship with Kip Thorne and had contributed to gravitational wave studies back in the 1970s. Even so, his name was not among the laureates. The absence had an objective reason rooted in the Nobel's rules. Since 1901, the prize has required direct experimental confirmation of the recognized work. The 2 most important results associated with Hawking's name, the singularity theorems and Hawking radiation, remained without definitive observational proof. His influence on theoretical physics was enormous, but influence does not substitute for experimental evidence under the prize's regulations. Hawking radiation remains one of the most famous concepts in modern physics, never directly observed. The theory proposes that black holes are not completely black. Due to quantum effects near the event horizon, they should slowly emit particles and lose mass over time until they completely evaporate. Decades after its original formulation, the phenomenon remains beyond the reach of contemporary astronomical instruments. In 2023, researchers at the University of Nottingham published in Nature results from experiments involving physical analogues of event horizons using perturbations in rotating water flow surfaces. The study did not detect real gravitational Hawking radiation. What the scientists achieved was the reproduction of mathematically equivalent systems, demonstrating that the theoretical mechanism works in analogous environments. Even as an important advance, it doesn't resolve the central problem. Direct observational confirmation of Hawking radiation remains absent. And since the Nobel is not awarded posthumously, the highest official recognition in physics will likely remain permanently out of Hawking's reach. Another problem associated with his legacy also remains, without a complete solution: the black hole information paradox. The issue arose when Hawking argued that the evaporation of black holes would permanently destroy physical information, something incompatible with the fundamental principles of quantum mechanics. In 2019, Ahmed Almhiri, Netta Engelhardt, Henry Maxfield, and Jeff Pennington published papers proposing a possible solution based on what they called information islands. The hypothesis uses topological structures, known as replica wormholes, to explain how information might mathematically escape the black hole evaporation process. The proposal rapidly became one of the most debated lines of research in contemporary theoretical physics. Thomas Hertog, a close collaborator of Hawking, commented in 2022 that Hawking would likely have found the idea extremely promising, though still incomplete. The comment captures the current state of the problem well. There are significant advances, but no universally accepted definitive solution. Hawking's scientific impact is typically measured through two main indicators: academic influence and intellectual formation. His papers accumulate over 60,000 citations on Google Scholar, led by his work on gravitational singularities and black hole evaporation. Those are numbers that place Hawking among the most cited theoretical physicists in modern history. At the same time, Hawking supervised relatively few doctoral students over the course of his career. There were 12 students over decades of work at Cambridge. The number is small by the standards of a scientist of his stature, but it directly reflected the practical limitations imposed by ALS and the communication difficulties that grew more severe with time. That combination created an unusual situation. Hawking was recognized by virtually the entire global scientific community, yet remained without the institutional prize best known to the general public. The absence of the Nobel produced a kind of symbolic gap between academic prestige and popular validation, and it was precisely in that space that Hawking constructed his public presence in the final decades of his life. Without the definitive stamp that transforms a scientist into an unquestionable authority for non-technical audiences, he began deploying a different kind of capital: global recognition of his face and his voice. His appearance, his motorized chair, and his synthesizer became instantly recognizable symbols anywhere in the world. Hawking understood early on that he possessed a rare platform, and he decided to use that platform not only to talk about cosmology, but to issue warnings about risks he believed were being ignored. Artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, climate change, autonomous weapons. and global political instability began to occupy growing space in his interviews. Hawking seemed to understand something uncomfortable. Perhaps the greatest dangers to humanity would not come from deep space, but from the very technologies being built here on Earth. Stephen Hawking died at his residence in Cambridge, at 3 West Road, on March 14, 2018, at 2:46 in the morning. The cause of death was respiratory failure, the standard terminal outcome for advanced ALS patients. When the respiratory muscles fail completely, the date, in the American system, is 3/14 Pi Day in mathematics, and, coincidentally, the birthday of Albert Einstein. Hawking had lived 55 years beyond his ALS diagnosis of March 1963, which had predicted 2 to 3 years of survival. The median survival after an ALS diagnosis is 2 to 5 years. Approximately 10% of patients survive longer than 10 years. Hawking's survival was statistically exceptional even within the long-term survivor subgroup. On June 15, 2018, Hawking's ashes were interred at Westminster Abbey, between the tombs of Isaac Newton and Charles Darwin. On the same day, the European Space Agency transmitted from the Sibres station in Avila, Spain, a radio signal encoding the black hole entropy equation S equals A4 in the direction of black hole 1,620 men 00, located 3,300 light-years from Earth. The signal will take 3,300 years to arrive at its destination. The developments in the years since Hawking's death represent the most direct empirical evidence available regarding the accuracy of his warnings. On artificial intelligence, the release of GPT-4 by OpenAI in March 2023, Claude 3 by Anthropic in March 2024, and Gemini Ultra by Google in December 2023 demonstrated language, reasoning, and task execution capabilities that surprised the very researchers who developed the systems. In March 2023, more than 1,000 AI researchers, including Yoshua Bengio of the Université de Montréal and Stuart Russell of UC Berkeley, signed a letter calling for a 6-month pause in the training of systems more powerful than GPT-4, explicitly citing the misalignment risks that Hawking had described in 2014. In May 2023, Sam Altman of OpenAI, Demis Hassabis of Google DeepMind, and Dario Amodei of Anthropic signed a joint statement equating the risk of misaligned AI with the risk of nuclear war and pandemic. The founders of the companies building the most capable AI systems publicly acknowledged the very risk that Hawking had described 9 years earlier. On bioengineering, the He Jiankui episode of November 2018 did not confirm the scale of risk. Hawking described the bifurcation of the species into 2 biologically distinct populations requires generations, not a single experiment. But it confirmed the mechanism with precision when the technology exists and the economic or scientific incentive exists. Germline editing occurs regardless of existing regulatory prohibitions. On interplanetary colonization, SpaceX completed the first full orbital flight of Starship in November 2023. The vehicle designed to transport humans to Mars, the less than -1-100 years timeline Hawking set at the Oxford Union in 2016 does not imply that colonization must be complete by 2116. It implies that the process of building the capacity must begin with sufficient urgency for self-sustaining colonies to exist within that window. The gap between the current pace of development and the pace required by Hawking's argument is observable and growing. What does not exist, and the absence is factually significant, is any equivalent to the 1968 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty for Artificial Intelligence or for Human Germline Editing. The NPT was negotiated with compliance verification, sanctions for violators, and an international inspection mechanism. For AI, there are voluntary corporate declarations and some national regulations without global coordination. For germline editing, there is a formal prohibition in many countries and a documented violation of that prohibition in 2018. The level of international institutional coordination in both areas is incomparably lower than what the risk described by Hawking would imply as an adequate response. The warnings Hawking issued produced measurable institutional consequences. The CSER at Cambridge, founded in 2012. The Future of Life Institute, founded in 2014. Open letters with over 8,000 AI signatories in 2015. But they did not produce a regulatory response proportionate to the described risk. Hawking's death in March 2018 was followed 8 months later by the He Jiankui scandal, confirming the bioengineering risk mechanism he had described with precision. The AI systems he identified as an existential risk in 2014 reached general language and multi-domain reasoning capabilities between 2023 and 2025. The people building those very systems began using the language of existential risk that Hawking had used a decade earlier. The risk mechanism is operating. The proportionate institutional response has not arrived. The central argument of this documentary holds up against the historical record. Hawking's warnings were not philosophical speculation. They were inferences drawn from scientific methodology, the identification of mechanisms in complex systems with nonlinear dynamics applied to questions of technology, biology, and existential risk. The same method that identified inevitable singularities in Einstein's equations identified problematic trajectories in technological systems with poorly specified objectives. The reflection the facts produce stands on its own. Hawking dedicated the final decade of his public life to warnings that demanded more physical and cognitive effort from him than any scientific paper. Producing a sentence took minutes. An interview took days. Each character was a deliberate, muscular decision in a physical system heading toward total silence. The choice to spend that limited communicative capital on warnings about artificial intelligence, bioengineering, and planetary colonization is, in itself, a data point. A data point produced by a man who knew the cost of every word and chose carefully which ones were worth saying. What we do with that data point is the only variable still open. If this video made you see Stephen Hawking in a completely different light, go ahead and leave a like. It helps the channel keep producing in-depth documentaries like this one. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you never miss another video, and share this documentary with someone who thinks they already know the full story behind Hawking. Because some of the most dangerous ideas in human history didn't originate in politics or on a battlefield. They were born inside equations.